Okay, right, let's get underway. Local authorities, have they got careless with the care market? And just a little bit, as John was saying, about the Institute of Public Care. We lead on the Developing Care Markets for Quality and Choice programme for the Department of Health. We were the originators of concepts around market facilitation and the use of market position statements by local authorities. We do work with CQC, we work with providers, and we work with a range of local authorities. I want to say something about three things. What kind of care market do we actually have in England at the moment? What kind of care market do we want, and how might we get that? But alternatively, what kind of care market might we actually end up with? So first of all, what kind of care market do we actually have in this country? Well, first of all, local authority involvement in the care market has changed quite a lot over the years. If we go back to pre-1945, the local authority was the overseer of the poor law system. It then moved to being substantially a provider of care with the founding of the welfare state, then moved on post-1980s into being a purchaser of care as compared to being predominantly a provider. And it's now moving into a fourth phase of being mainly a facilitator of the care market. The care market at the moment is a number of considerations. It's certainly one where local authority exerts increasingly less control. It's highly fragmented across the country. It is a significant economic force. It's a market that has quite a level of financial instability to it, and what I would say a large number of fairly frustrated providers. Just as an example of fragmentation, if we look at this table, if folk can see that around the country, the amount of care beds purchased by local authorities varies enormously, from just under half in the southeast of England through to around 80% in the northeast of England. So quite a substantial variation. I wanted to look into this in a little bit more detail. So being an academic, I decided to construct a random trial here, and I asked my daughter, when she wasn't deeply engrossed in the delights of One Direction, to ask her to pick a letter between A and Z. Fortunately, she didn't pick Z because there aren't many care providers beginning with Z, but she did actually choose B. So I looked at the range of care groups, not individual care homes, but care groups beginning with B across the country. And what that chart shows us is that dominated by two providers, Bupa and Barchester, a number in bond care, but most of those groups very small, only owning maybe a handful of homes. So we have a market with one or two quite large providers, but a whole series of small providers. So 12,500 social care providers registered with CQC, around 13,000 care homes with some 247,000 beds, 6,800 agencies providing domiciliary care. So huge fragmentation across the care market. And that was illustrated by our sample. 636 homes, of which 508 were owned by just two groups. The remaining 128 owned by 17 other companies. It is, however, quite a significant economic force, and I think one that is quite underrated. Last year, local authorities spent £4.5 billion on older people's residential care at an average of £30 million per authority. 1.63 million people work in this sector, very significant. 2/3 of all jobs in adult social care are also in the private and voluntary sector. And one of the authorities we're working with at the moment, Bradford, a workforce of around 100,000 people in employment, about 18,000 of those work in the care and leisure sector. I know quite a few will be in leisure, but a very significant number of those within the care business. Something that I think many local authorities don't recognise, just what a significant economic force the care business is. Also, some of these companies, very, very sizable. If we look at Barchester, for example, 11,000 residents, 14,000 staff. By any yardstick, a very significant company in this country and one of the larger companies. Bupa, a worldwide organisation, 29,000 care home residents, 38,000 employees. So very sizable, significant companies exerting quite an influence, not just in the care market, but across markets overall. Interestingly, the top 10 providers control 11% of the homes, but have 21% of the beds. And that tells you, first of all, that the larger providers tend to have the larger homes. And particularly if you look at new developments, care homes now being built tend to be around 60, 70 beds, although the average size of care homes is only around 30 to 40 beds. So a substantial difference over time. You might have thought the market was in crisis, but Savills just a couple of years ago was saying there's still a considerable demand for purchasers of care homes and a considerable economic cost if you want to purchase, say, in the southeast at the high end of the market. Many of those care companies are very deliberate in their purchases and in their behaviour. This is a quote from Mike Parsons saying they've got all manner of computer models to look at where Barchester should develop next. But one of the ones they use quite often, they say Barchester is similar to Waitrose and Majestic, and so they look where there isn't a Barchester home, where there's a Waitrose and a Majestic, and decide to build there. I have to say, it's my kind of ideal dream, a care home with a Waitrose on site and a wine merchants. But there you go. It is, however, a market that is still very unstable. This is a quote about Bondcare just last year in The Guardian. Bondcare running into serious financial difficulties, carrying a very high level of debt and trying to transfer some of that debt to other companies. NHP, for example, registered in the Cayman Islands, and yet the owners of many of Four Seasons homes, a debt burden of 1.8 million in November 2012. So this is not a market that at the moment is underpinned by strong financial stability. Barchester also reported £1 billion worth of debt due to mature in October 2013. Again, Barchester having other companies that own it that are located outside the UK. The other side, I think, of the care market is providers being frustrated. All of these are very recent quotes I've taken from work that we've done with care provider organisations. We went to a meeting about the cuts. There were 6 members of the commissioning team there. Only 1 spoke and the other 5 watched. If they're supposedly hard up, what are they all doing there? They think things are bad for them, but I'm actually on the verge of going under because the price for home care is not at a level that's sustainable for the kind of business I want to run. I can't get out because I owe too much. I can't continue because I'm losing money week on week. So a number of providers very frustrated with the situation that they find themselves in, particularly I think a number of small providers of home care and care homes. However, providers also said, we recognise the financial climate we're in, we recognise what's happening to the public sector. Why doesn't the local authority come and talk to us first and foremost about ways in which we can help them in terms of restructuring stuff? We can't make change overnight, but we can make change over a period of years and maybe provide a good product at a better price. So I think providers are recognising that situation and willing to engage with local authorities. So if that's where the care market's at the moment, what kind of care market do we want? Well, how do we focus on the future? Who do we think should be in residential care? And what are some of the cost benefits of intervention? I think at a time of financial restriction, and this is very true of many of the local authorities we work with, it's very easy just to focus on the loss of money and focus on how do we make the cuts that we need to make at the current time. The danger of that is that we lose focus on the money that we still have and how we spend that to best advantage. It's easy to get absorbed by making those kind of financial changes. And I think also to a small provider, if you're a small home care provider or a single residential home in a local authority, the local authority may feel its power is diminishing, but to you they still look all powerful. They not only control the flow of people into adult social care, they control planning permission, they control roads and highways. They can be very significant to you as a small provider. So although the perspective is changing, local authorities to many providers still seem very powerful. Well, who do we think residential care is for? There's much discussion within health and social care about who shouldn't be in residential care and how we build up prevention. I think there's a danger in that model, and what we need to try and do is turn it around and say, who do we actually think benefits from residential care? Is there a group we can identify that say, yes, these folk are better off in residential care than they are in other settings. Nationally, we know the numbers went up slightly last year, but what sort of numbers should we be projecting for the future? Does dementia automatically mean residential care? The trend over the last 10 to 15 years has been for frail older people to remain in the community and for people with dementia, by and large, to end up in care homes. But should that be the way we're thinking? There are some extra care housing schemes that cater well for people with dementia. Should we be looking to extend that, and should we be looking to extend community services? Does extra care housing financially stack up? Has it been totally dependent on the benefit system, and is that going to work well in the long term? And are the drivers within that system, within residential care, actually against us or in favour of us? So we would argue local authorities need to think quite hard, and health CCGs need to think quite hard about who benefits from residential care. What are some of the cost benefits of interventions that reduce demand, and are we even focused on those? In the current climate, there are really only three things that local authorities can do. They can be more efficient, and most authorities have tried most of the routes that they can go down with the efficiencies argument. They can raise more revenue, either through higher charges or by combining with health or by combining with housing organisations. Or, as I think John and I would argue, they need to focus much more on how do we actually reduce demand? How do we make sure fewer people come through into that system? An important part of that role is the part that voluntary sector organisations play. And one of the things we need to question is, do voluntary organisations actually reduce demand, or do they give people a taste of care? Does it give people a leg up onto a care system, which maybe we could be avoiding? And we need to look in the plethora of grant funding of voluntary organisations whether that actually reduces demand or not. Do our contracts encourage providers to drive down demand? If I was a home care provider being paid by cost and volume, all my incentives would be to make people more dependent, not less dependent, because that way, potentially long term, I end up with more business. So should we be shifting our contracts around so they're much more focused on outcomes, and we're paying people by the outcomes they deliver rather than by the number of people that go through a system? Do direct payments and personal budgets encourage a reduction in demand, or do they encourage people to buy up to the limit of their care costs? And finally, is reducing demand at the top of the agenda of the new health and wellbeing boards? If it's not, then I think we're going to run into serious problems in the future. So what's the wider local authority role? I think one of the bodies that is critical and that is very much not linked in to either health organisations or into social care are the planning authority. The planning authority control where care homes get located, they control extra care housing schemes. Planning and social care should be working much more closely together, rather than, as one director of adult care said to me recently, the first time we knew this scheme was taking place was when the hoardings went up around the site and the planning authority hadn't talked to us. We need to look at how we use business development and regeneration in local authorities to stimulate care businesses and provide support to care providers. One of the biggest assets held in trust for older people in this country is supported housing, sheltered housing. A lot of that is steadily withering on the vine, out of date, inappropriate, sometimes bedsitter accommodation, often with asbestos on it. Yet the market value of that accommodation represents the single biggest financial asset we hold in trust for older people, and that is simply not being used well at the moment. And also, more older people are surviving into older age with a learning disability. Some of those, particularly with Down syndrome, will contract dementia early on. And we need to make sure that the environments for that population and for older people work well. Older people will only remain within the community if the community works well for them. It's no point, as I found only recently, taking somebody in a wheelchair and having a drop curb on one side of the pavement but not on the other side of the road, and there's a rather large lorry heading towards you. They are simple examples, but they are things that we need to address if we're going to make environments work for older people. So it is about drop curbs, about street lighting, about community assets like shops and banks being locally available, and also about how we support older people and people with a learning disability within those neighbourhoods. So what are some of the characteristics of a future care market? I think we're looking at a local market economy that has a balance of providers. Some large providers, some small, some that are in the voluntary sector, some in the private sector, some that are social enterprises. I think generally care consumers need to have a better knowledge of who you are actually buying from. And so we would like to see far more information about care companies out there in the public domain. The whole of the local authority needs to recognise the role that it's taking on, and particularly the role towards older people. If we look, say, at, for example, Herefordshire, a third of all their population by 2020 will be aged 65 and over. That's not just an issue for adult social care, it's an issue for the whole local authority and the whole of the health community. I've already said a much stronger relationship with planning and development, and also I think a published evidence-based approach to procurement so that local authorities know why they are buying and what they expect from that and what are the outcomes they hope to achieve. We also need to move to an environment where there can be discussions between providers and local authorities outside tendering and procurement arrangements. They are not good vehicles for long-term planning of the sector. And finally, the ability to provide seed corn funding for innovation. Government tends to pepper at the moment every second paragraph of its documents with saying there's a need to innovate. Providers are not going to innovate unless there is financial assistance to enable them to do that. So, if that's the kind of care market we need, what kind of care market do I think we might end up with? Three things. The impact of healthcare performance. Much has been made recently about the healthcare and performance in relation to older people. But overall, we know that the health service is predominantly an old age service, dominated by a population aged 65 and over, many of whom have a dementia. The growth in inpatient episodes amongst older people has proceeded at nearly double the pace of other inpatient episodes. The key conditions that older people suffer from, if you look at the Royal College of Physicians reports around dementia, around continence, around falls and around strokes, are all areas of poor performance by the NHS. The danger here is that as the NHS becomes under more pressure, the temptation to move more people in for a taste of the acute sector and then potentially to move them on to residential care becomes ever greater in the pressure on that system. We need to look at cost reductions on community interventions. One of the things I said recently to a local authority that was trumpeting how they'd managed to slice a bit off the amount they were paying for home care services. And we were saying, well, look at the number of people in your community that actually work in home care. By actually reducing price, what you are doing is impoverishing your own local community. Is that really the strategic direction you want to be going down, or are there alternatives? Also, will reducing the price for care actually drive out some of the small providers, some of the more innovative providers that are precisely the ones that local authorities want to encourage? Bigger providers can probably sustain themselves through a financial crisis more than many small ones have. Innovation needs to be cost effective if providers are going to take a risk. So if you want people to do something new, something different, if you want them to step outside what they've done in the past, we have to look at the financial risks associated with that. Government also is very keen on the development of micro providers, very small providers providing care to just a handful of people. But we also need to judge, is that a cost-effective route? Is that one that's actually going to work well long term? And finally, although not so much in the south of England, still in the north of England, there is a volume of in-house provision. Is that appropriate? And particularly, is it appropriate when you look at the cost basis of in-house provision? I've mentioned company funding and the issues with some of the care companies, but big business in the care sector is not automatically bad. However, local authorities need to have the capacity to monitor that much better than they have done in the past. And if you look at when Southern Cross, a large amount of money was taken out of the business, nobody from the regulator and nobody from the local authorities said anything at the time that they thought that that was a very bad move. So we need to be able to monitor companies, we need to be able to monitor changing companies, particularly amongst personnel and senior managers, and that monitoring also needs to move outside care organisations into some of the housing and voluntary sector providers every bit as much as the private sector. Finally, this is a market of checks and balances, the care system. We do need to look very carefully at how we spend money. I was talking to a local authority yesterday, a very substantial shire county, spends £188 million on residential care for older people and people with a learning disability each year. In their market position statement, they had one line about quality, which says, we think quality is reasonably okay. Very little about the state of their care market and how effectively it works and functions. As taxpayers, I think we should expect local authorities that are spending £188 million in a sector to know much more about who they're spending that money with and what the expectations, what the outcomes are from that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Kerslake. There's just time probably for a couple of questions. Try and keep them brief if you can. Are there questions for Professor Kerslake? There's a couple down here. Where's the mic? I've lost the mic. Oh, you found another person. We'll come down to you after we've dealt with the person at the back.
Councillor Barry McLachlan, London Borough of Harrow. I'd just like to ask a little bit about the issue about reducing demand and the integration of public health into local authority control and better integration, because that seems to be a real opportunity that local authorities can drive down the costs that they've done so in other parts of the care sector. Now they've got public health under their remit.
So will public health help?
Yeah, I completely agree. I would like to see public health focusing much more on the evidence base to enable local authorities to commission by outcome and maybe a little bit less attention on obese faggers. And for me, I think they have a lot of knowledge and expertise about how you can make judgments about which outcomes work and which ones don't. And I'd like to see public health much more integrated into that.
Okay, good sharp answer. Gentleman down the front there.
Thank you. Philip Watson, Chief Executive of the Manor Gardens Welfare Trust, Run Health and Community Centre in Islington. It's really, if you could give a quick clarity on one of the points that you made was around the voluntary sector causing people to get a taste of care and that being a problem. I didn't really understand that. The other aspect of that is that what it does seem to me at the moment, a lot of what local authorities are doing is they're cutting out a lot of the work that the voluntary sector is able to do, particularly in terms of combating social isolation, which then leads to a lot of the problems that we're seeing. And I wonder whether you had a view on that also.
Okay, two things on that. One is we're working with quite a large shire county at the moment, and one of the things we've been doing is a review of local grants to voluntary organisations by the county council, by district councils and by the health service. And one of the things that is very clear is there is no coordinated set of outcomes that you are looking for from that local voluntary sector. Indeed, a lot of the grants are historical, they've been given over time, they're given sometimes because they're elected members, pet organisation, and there's very little structure to what you're doing and whether those outcomes actually drive down demand or whether potentially they might increase demand by bringing people into the care system. So what I'm arguing for is saying not that we should give less to voluntary organisations, but that we need a much greater focus to the outcomes that they're going to achieve. Equally, I think those voluntary organisations need to be much sharper about the outcomes they think that they deliver. And a lot of voluntary organisations simply promote themselves through anecdote or through case studies. I think they need to be much better at quantifying the impact that they have.
Right, that stimulated the other lady in the front row to
Yeah, obviously, I'm generalising about the voluntary sector, but on the other hand, I would argue, in having done work with a range of voluntary sector providers, that many voluntary organisations find it hard to say what outcomes they actually deliver. I'm not talking about the number of people they deliver a service to or quantifying the service. I am saying that what we need to be is what outcomes do we think we're delivering for a population, and should we give that sector more funding to deliver those outcomes or less? So, I'm simply saying the basis of that money going across needs to be much sharper, and voluntary organisations need to be sharper in responding to that. Some Age UK organisations are very good at doing that. Some areas are not so good at doing that.
I think I could echo that comment. We've got time for one last question from the lady in the middle here with the dark coat on. Just right in the middle row. Put your hand up, the guy will get. That's great, thank you.
I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more on the difference of cost between residential care and extra care. Obviously, both are quite expensive, but there must surely be a difference. And is there also some element about people being in extra care for longer, which makes the sort of the long-term costs stack up?
I think overall there probably needs to be more work done on the long-term financial modelling of extra care, because as you say, many people come in for a much longer period of time. Quite a number of people come into extra care housing quite rightly with no care needs at all. So you need to look at how you stratify that population. I think the point I was making was that in residential care, the costs fall either on the local authority or on the funder in total. Whereas if you're in extra care housing, you're still eligible for a range of benefits because you still live within the community. So it's easy to say extra care housing looks a lot cheaper, but if you added up the total cost of the public purse, it may not necessarily be as cheap as we often think it is. Personally, I'd be a strong advocate of extra care housing, mainly because I've never seen the care home that I want to end my days in.
All right, I think we've just about hit the half hour for this slot. I thought it was very stimulating, very interesting. Can we thank Professor Kerslake? Thank you.